Ambassador, thank you very much for joining us on Euronews. The war is ongoing, but the president of the U.S. seems to be changing the goalpost. First, he said this is a 4 to 5 weeks war, and now he says it's almost practically done. Is there really a plan?
Well, that's a question that we are all, really, it's a general question. What is the goal of this operation? And is it really change? Because at the beginning of the operation, President Trump was saying that he wanted to change the regime to this really in Iran. After that, it was the nuclear question, which was raised by the Americans, and now it's a question of, in a sense, destroying the military Iranian apparatus. Well, the general impression is that Trump really thought that Iran would react the way that Venezuela reacted. Apparently, it didn't work. Apparently, the Iranians really have made the choice of waiting. I'm sure that they believe that sooner or later, President Trump went, as the Americans say, caco. You know that they tackle that the American president is going, in a sense, to chicken out and really to say, considering the price of the oil, considering the situation in the Gulf, that basically at some moment Trump is going to say, I am the winner, and it's the end of the story. I think that's what we are facing right now.
I've got to ask you, of course, this is a very different President Trump, because he always said he didn't want to force changes in countries, and now we're seeing a very different foreign policy agenda. So I've got to ask you, is this really an American war, or is this really Israel dragging the U.S. into war?
I think it's a good question, because you know that Trump, really even before he entered the political life, actually was criticizing the presidents, the American presidents before him, because he was opposed to these military endeavors throughout the world. And for the MAGA crowd, I think it was an important element that the Americans, really were not going to waste their money while the U.S. itself, there are a lot of things to change. Apparently, and it's quite a surprise, and frankly, personally, I didn't expect it. Suddenly, you have Donald Trump, who is engaged into a sort of neoconservative policy. The only difference right now with George H. Bush was, at the time, George H. Bush was dreaming of bringing democracy. He was using American military force to export democracy, while with Trump doesn't care about democracy. So the question is, and it's a question which is raised by a lot of Americans, is whether it's a decision that really Netanyahu has succeeded to convince Trump to enter into this war. I think it's a very negative question for the future of Israel, because it's going to it's going to feed in the MAGA crowd, where anti-Semitism has always been, really dormant. Really, I think it could have very negative consequences on the relationship between the U.S. and Israel.
Of course, and we talked about anti-Semitism here too in Europe. But I got to ask you then if this is really an effort pushed by Israel, what is the goal for Prime Minister Netanyahu?
I think for Israel, in a sense, everything has changed October the 7th. Still, October the 7th, there is a sort of balance in the Middle East, really, and the border with Lebanon is peaceful, and with Hamas, actually, there is also a modus vivendi between Israel and the Hamas, since Israel was accepting Qatar to send money, to bring money to the Hamas. So there is a sort of balance. The October the 7th was such a trauma for the Israelis, and also was so serious that Israel has decided that it couldn't go back to the situation of October the 6th. We wanted to change the modus vivendi, the geopolitical situation in the Middle East, in a sense to impose a sort of hegemony in the Middle East. and they've been quite successful with the Hezbollah, really quite successful. So the last obstacle to the Israeli military supremacy is Iran. So sooner or later, really Israel and Iran would confront really regularly and very directly. So I think for the Israelis right now, the question is to get rid of Iran as a great power in the Middle East.
In the region.
And that's what they are trying to do. So if tomorrow I think Trump is taco, if Trump is really saying, I'm leaving, I've won the war, this time I'm not convinced that Israel will stop the bombings.
Of course, the message that we get with the line of succession is that the hardliners are still in place in Tehran. How do you see this playing out? Is there a scenario which ultimately they have no other choice but to get on the phone and talk to President Trump, even if until now it's just been retaliation and they've not picked up the phone that we know to Washington?
No, I think, unfortunately, I think that if I were, if I were an Ayatollah, I would simply do what the Iranians are doing right now. And I think that right now they hope, again, as I have said, that Trump will leave, saying, I've won, I've killed Khamenei, and I have destroyed all the military capabilities of Iran, I'm leaving. And the result will be to have the Gulf states suddenly facing, I think, a revenge, really an Islamic Republic full of revenge, and really look at Khamenei, the son, apparently the new supreme leader. Really, you have to imagine his father, his mother, his son, his brother, his sister-in-law, his nephew have been killed in a few days by the Americans. Really, he's a human being. Whatever you think of him, he is going to make, I think, if the Americans leave, and I think they don't have the choice at the end of the day, he will want to have a revenge. And the Gulf states will be actually very vulnerable.
Of course, there's a question around the security himself for this individual, but I got to ask you about the Europeans. Where is Europe in this crisis? And the fact I've got to ask you says a lot.
When I was teaching international relations in Paris, I was always saying, if you have a question about Europeans, the first sentence that you should use is the Europeans will be divided. We are, by definition, divided because we are, we have different powers, different geography with different history. Obviously, you see, for instance, that Germany is sticking to the US and sticking to Israel. It's obvious. Most of the Europeans, I would say, are trying to hide themselves. They don't want to be taken between the American hammer and again, maybe the Israeli handmill or the Iranian handmill. So most of Europeans are looking the other way and waiting for the end of the crisis. You have some countries which are more active. Spain has been really on the front line of really sticking to the international law, and has been very active.
Some say Spain has now taken the part of France. If there was an echo to the Iran invasion, some would say Spain is now the French voice at the time. Would you agree?
I think, in a sense, to be frank, I think the Spanish Prime Minister was on the front line. The French have rejoined the Spaniards, and now one by one, the European countries are really assessing that the operation is in a dead end, and also assessing that their public opinion is more and more moved by the suffering of the civilian population in Iran, but also in Lebanon.
And if I may just lastly, of course, the one woman who seems to want to be very active is the head of the European Commission. Are you surprised by the role that the head of the Commission is playing and wants to play? Is she in the wrong, or ultimately is she a smart operator?
I am a bit, I'm a bit surprised because she's out of her competence. The treaty, the treaty, which is the basis of the European Union, doesn't give her any special competence in foreign policy. On the top of that, she's sticking to a line which, again, it's not the line of Spain, it's not the line of France, it's a German line. Really, so especially, which is more important in a sense than the treaties, is the fact that the Europeans are the last flag bearer of international law. Really, it's, I should say, the DNA of the European Union is the international law, and to hear the president of the European Commission saying that really it's not that important. The way the Germans actually are saying what the Germans are saying, frankly, you can ask a lot of questions about that. Yes, I think there is a division in the European Union, not at a very bad moment, but again, as I've told you, with the Europeans are always divided.
But on this point, just very briefly, what she did say is that the EU stands for international law, but it cannot be the custodian of a world that no longer exists. Does she have a point, or is she in the wrong? Is this the wrong time to make that statement?
Frankly, to be for, it's a bit like somebody who is, well, it's very French, who is somebody is in the middle of adultery and is going and is saying, oh, actually, I am in favor of the principle of marital fidelity while committing adultery. It's not the international law is not only a principle, really coming from heaven, but it's a policy, and which means that it should have consequences, and we should, the Europeans, really, in a sense, saying we have to react against the Israel and against the US.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much on the geopolitics and marriage too. Thank you for joining us. Always great to see you.
Thank you. A pleasure.